Thanks, and I want to echo Eli's comments about really supporting the overall mission of this program that the Wilson Center and NBR are putting on. And if I weren't participating in it as an insider, I would certainly be supporting it from the outside. And I'm thrilled to be here. The comments in the paper are certainly my own thoughts, not those of the Navy School or anybody else I work for. What I'm trying to do is play around a little bit with what the new nuclear age looks like. When we think about nuclear weapons, we're still rooted in a Cold War mentality. The way that we think about deterrence theory still comes out of that era, right? And the early Cold War had a period of a lot of instability, and then you have some learning, and by the end of the Cold War, many would argue nuclear weapons contributed to the stability of the long peace. Through arms control agreements, but also through an understanding of the great devastating consequences that would have come about. About a decade ago, there began a fairly vibrant discussion of the second nuclear age, trying to move beyond the Cold War points that emphasized proliferation, and then more recently has emphasized the potential for non-state actors to engage in nuclear crises. I think while that's an important first step, that's insufficient for understanding Asia today. Asia is different in a couple of different ways. So I highlight three different factors that I think are going to create what I'm calling a complex strategic environment. It's not just nuclear polarity, but a couple of other factors. First, though, there is nuclear multipolarity in East Asia. I'll talk about that. Second, long-range nuclear systems are only part of the strategic equation. Come back to that point. And then third, different countries in East Asia hold different views about the utility and the role of nuclear weapons. So these are the three kind of foundational points that I want to develop a little bit. And then I want to talk about how those interact to make the nuclear balance, the nuclear situation in East Asia much more complex, much more dangerous than what we faced in the Cold War. And I think that has quite negative implications for the U.S. in the region, as well as for those geographically stuck in the region. So let me talk first about this nuclear multipolarity, right? Fairly straightforward. We had bipolarity in the Cold War for the most part. The U.S. and the Soviet arsenals were so much larger than the other three established nuclear powers that you could usefully use bilateral balances as the construct. In the paper, I present a table that highlights, the distribution has flattened. As the U.S. and the Russians have come down, you have an increase in number, doubling the number of nuclear powers in the region, but also spreading out the ratios. So you've gone from a 50-to-1 U.S. Or Soviet Chinese ratio down to 20-to-1. Maybe the U.S. Chinese ratio was 40-to-1 down to 10-to-1. And then, it's certainly a lopsided distribution, but then if you look across China to South Asia, that too has become flatter. The ratios remain lopsided, fair enough, that is the arsenal sizes. But nuclear weapons do not create power through a linear assessment of force ratios. And so I think even at lopsided ratios, you're going to want to think a little bit more carefully about the interaction of those arsenal sizes. Beyond that, of course, delivery systems are modernizing literally across the board throughout the region, all of the six countries, including North Korea, including the South Asian countries, China, United States, and Russia. Okay, so multipolarity, that's one important change in the post-Cold War era. I'd like to have a term for it. If somebody comes up, they're going to have lots of footnotes.
Post-cube.
Post-cube, right. Second is what I'm calling the multidimensionality of strategic competition. And what I'm looking for here is some way to describe the concept that we've moved beyond strategic, offensive, long-range nuclear weapons as being the primary or the sole factor that we need to worry about. And obviously that's always been a little bit of an oversimplification. But we began the Cold War thinking about nuclear weapons as strategic in that they could address strategic needs without overcoming operational, without securing operational victory. You didn't have to defeat the adversary on the battlefield to have a strategic effect through the use of city-busting atomic and later nuclear weapons. Over time in the Cold War, we began to distinguish between tactical weapons and strategic weapons. So the unitary focus on strategic isn't quite fair. But that situation has gotten worse today. The nascent missile defense systems that were available, particularly to the Soviets during the Cold War, are now much more capable and spread throughout the region. You have United States, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, India, Russia, and China all fielding different categories of missile defense systems, both theater and point defense systems in many cases. The distinction between tactical and strategic weapons, which made some sense in a U.S.-Soviet conflict, doesn't make a lot of sense when the range issue for neighboring states means that tactical weapons can have strategic effects, just in the same way that tactical effects didn't feel all that tactical to European states during the Cold War. But that's commonplace throughout East Asia. All right, finally, the idea that there is this third category of divergence of views about the utility of nuclear weapons. The question here isn't, are nuclear weapons useful, but how do states conceive of their utility? What role does nuclear strategy serve in the overall national strategy of a country? Now, in the Cold War, it wasn't exactly that both sides viewed the role of nuclear weapons exactly the same. Mutually assured destruction was much more accepted on the American side, and even only on a subset of American thinking than it was on the Soviet. But I would argue that the differences are much narrower in the Cold War. Let me just run through a couple, and again, the paper provides a chart where I try to match these up with different states. And the argument here is there's about 5 or 6 different ways you can think about nuclear weapons working, and the states in the region have different views, don't have the same view. One, and I think this is the one we're all most comfortable with, nuclear weapons can deter the use of other nuclear weapons against your own cities. In a fight over, national annihilation. Okay, fair enough. Second, in the Cold War, we thought a lot, and the Soviets even more, about restraining escalation in the context of a nuclear war. After you've crossed the nuclear threshold, nuclear war fighting might deter the other side from going all out against your cities. That would be second. Third, during the Cold War, we and the Soviets, or the Russians today, think about nuclear weapons deterring large-scale conventional attack against their own state. Fourth, extended deterrence. You can deter both conventionally and nuclear attacks on a third party. So that's one set of issues. Related to that are, how large of an arsenal do you need to achieve those different goals? Can you achieve, and then a fourth would be kind of coercive, a fifth would be coercive utility of nuclear weapons in the way that I think you see North Korea trying to get coercive utility today. You could then talk about the different arsenal sizes. The U.S. and the Soviets talked themselves into thinking that you needed tens of thousands of weapons to achieve some of the missions that I just outlined. States in the region today have different perspectives about what arsenal size needs to match up with different strategies. So, you can argue about whether I've coded in the paper the different states correctly as to what strategy they're trying to achieve, but I think most people would agree that there is a range of views about the role that nuclear weapons are intended to serve. All right, so where does that leave us? Each one of these causes problems in and of themselves. Obviously, if you've got multiple players, the simple bilateral games that we all teach. How many people have taught in the room Prisoner's Dilemma? My guess is all of you who have taught Prisoner's Dilemma. Teaching that for a 3-person or 3-party competition gets much more complex. I'm not a big quantitative or modeler, but when you read the papers on truels, on 3-way duels, it gets very complex, and the outcomes are highly dependent on the specification of the models. For me as a consumer, what that means is slight changes in perception about the role of nuclear weapons, about the size of your arsenal, about the nature of warning, is going to change the outcome, which means you're not going to have a stable outcome in the way that we were comfortable talking about finding repeated, iterated Prisoner's Dilemma having some stable outcome. The complexity of nuclear forces mean that finding any stable outcome in the interaction between offensive and defensive weapons, you throw in precision-guided munitions, prompt global strike, that problem gets exacerbated, is also problematic. Because everybody makes conservative estimates, when you've got to make conservative estimates about the number of offensive weapons, the number of defensive weapons, the effectiveness of those defensive weapons, the number that are going to be survivable after a first strike with precision conventional weapons, that becomes even more problematic. These all then tend to also interact. When you have a different conception about the role of nuclear weapons in your own national strategy, then finding an arms control solution or a stable tacit arsenal size that won't provoke a spiral, an arms race spiral with another country becomes even more problematic. You've got one conception of what nuclear weapons do in your strategy. They have a different in their strategy. A third country has maybe a third. There isn't going to be an easy way to have all three of your security needs met. That bodes very poorly both for formal and informal arms control and restraint. So what I'd like to do kind of as I continue with this project is develop a little bit both the negatives that come out of this, but also any potential solutions in terms of the nature of force structure that might mitigate some of these concerns, but also an awareness of what sorts of problems this is likely to lead to in nuclear competition in East Asia. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks very much. I'll turn it over